Thank you guys for having me here today. I am Tyler Replogle, Principal Solutions Architect at AWS. I also worked at MarkLogic before, and I was a customer before that too. So I know a lot about NoSQL databases, know a lot about MarkLogic. When I was at MarkLogic, I helped people move to the cloud too, so I know more than just AWS Cloud. But that's what we're going to talk about today, is running MarkLogic on AWS and how we can achieve that operational Zen and how you can really understand what's going on in your underlying infrastructure. One of the things that MarkLogic is really good at is designing for failure. And one of the things that we have as a principle here and a design that we've talked about when we're building our infrastructure at AWS is that everything fails all the time. That's the quote that we have. So you have to design for failure. That's the next kind of part of that, is how do you design for failure? How do you design for this? And this is some of the stats that we see from our customers on AWS and when they're running on-prem and when they're moving to theirs. How do they handle those outages? And what are the costs of those outages? And what we can see over here is that it is a significant amount of cost for our customers when they're thinking about, what does it take for them to think about running in the cloud or running high availability or disaster recovery, and how can they alleviate and remove these things? So that's what our challenge is today, is how can we do that, and how can we run that in a space where we don't have to worry about our database running or the infrastructure down below that database running. So we design for failure. There we go. And that's what we've architected out our infrastructure to run, just like MarkLogic is designed for failure too, to handle failure. What I mean for that is if you've set up the architecture in such a way, you can have your E nodes and your D nodes, and the D nodes can have the data, and they can be set up in a place where you have a cluster, and then you've got replicas of that data, and it can replicate over to another database. So that's the database space. MarkLogic's really good at handling that, but it's a database. It can't handle the infrastructure down below it because it's designed as a database. So you need something that can do that same kind of failure, design failure, to be able to ensure that you've got infrastructure that can handle the same ways that MarkLogic can handle the data layer. So this is a reference architecture of if you were running MarkLogic on AWS. It's kind of a standard one that we have. It's one that's kind of a fit-all for everybody, but there's some things that you can do to tweak it, and we'll talk about what those are. I'll go into this in a little bit here, but what we have is our AWS cloud, and that can span multiple regions. Quick question here, has anybody used AWS before or know what that is? Okay, all right, a little bit of stuff there. Awesome. Anybody used MarkLogic before? Okay, I want to make sure that we got a level setting here where we're at. So what we've got over here is MarkLogic running in a single region on AWS. You could have it running in multiple regions, but this is a single region over here. And what we call here, this would be like our availability zones is the second layer, and those are kind of equated to a data center. Typically, there's multiple data centers in the availability zone, but we keep them close. They're within 100 miles of each other so that you can have that speed of light aspect of things, but then they're in different floodplains, or there might be different power connected to them so that if for some reason power went out, you'd have everything that you need there too. Then you have your MarkLogic instances running over here, and inside of that you have an autoscaler. And we'll talk about what that does for you, but you might think what it sounds like. It helps you scale automatically, helps you recover from things like if a node goes down for some reason. It doesn't happen all the time, but we just talked about designing for failure. It could happen. It's a possibility, and so you want to think about what you do for that. We'll go into more detail about some of the other pieces here, but here's some of the services that you can use to run MarkLogic on AWS and get that Zen that we were talking about. So one of the things that I want to talk about here is why do customers choose AWS over some of the other cloud vendors that are out there or just running it on-prem? We first started creating AWS after we were using it for ourselves to run Amazon.com. You've probably heard of Prime Day. There's a lot of infrastructure that goes into making sure that Prime Day runs smoothly to make sure that we don't miss an order. That would be a bad thing for us if somebody put something into a cart and then we didn't have the actual physical item for that. So we want to make sure that we have ACID compliance and everything set up within our infrastructure as well to run that. Or if someone were to try to go to the website and they're not able to get it. We talk about that downtime would be the same kind of thing over here. One aspect of it too is that it's global. So we have 37 and counting regions. We're adding more regions. Those regions are a geographical location that has those availability zones in them. And then we have 300 plus security and services as well that we have over here. I'm not going to touch too much on each one of these, but just want to give you an idea of what that looks like. This is a little bit of what I was talking about before, of what our infrastructure looks like, and I didn't realize how it would look on the screen over here. There's a graph of the world over here, and these little points are across the world. That doesn't come across on the screen. Sorry about that. And this is what you might look like within an availability zone over here, and then within the availability zone, we'll have multiple data centers. So just to give you a visual expectation of a representation of what I was talking about, inside of an availability zone, we have an additional design for failure aspect. So I'm just kind of diving deeper and deeper so you can understand how we've set up the infrastructure for this. And what we were talking about before, MarkLogic would run in a region on multiple availability zones. So we've designed for that disaster recovery, for the distance aspect of things too. And sometimes if you wanted to have a DR solution, let's just say something happened over here in the DC area because we talk about this a lot in the federal spaces. They have this requirement where they have to be 500 miles away from each other, different sites. And so if you wanted to do that, you wouldn't have that in one region. You'd have two different regions that are farther away from each other. And MarkLogic can do replication to that other region so that you can ensure that all of your data is up to date, and you could go and switch to the other region and be able to deploy and run there. Or you could run what we call an active-active, where you're doing them at the same time. So let me look at an example here of what would happen for failure. So I'm not saying that MarkLogic goes down, but let's just say that the node that MarkLogic is running goes down on. So it's not a MarkLogic problem, but I'll tell you what, I worked in consulting, and the first thing that people say the problem is like, oh, it's a MarkLogic problem. And then you're always trying to tell them, well, wait a second, it's not a MarkLogic problem, it's an infrastructure problem. And so we always spend a lot of time talking to people about what actually is the problem here. And this can happen even inside of AWS. You can have a node that goes down for whatever reason. Sometimes something happened, you just want to restart that node and do it. And so that's why it's inside of an auto-scaling group over here. And if we've set up the cluster correctly, we would have another copy of that data in availability zone 1. It'd also be in, A, it would be in B and C. And so then we can fail over, and we can reinstantiate another one. And this can happen speed-wise in about 15 minutes. We can set up a new EC2 instance if we weren't already running like a hot one. If some customers, they want to have so much availability that they pay just to have extra instances running all the time. It's possible to do that too, but it's a cost analysis of what do you want to pay for on that aspect. So auto-scaling groups, this is what I was just talking about, a little deeper dive into that. That's able to do a couple of things. It's able to do health, kind of restarting of an instance. It also can help you if you're going to update instances too. So update the underlying infrastructure behind it. What I'm talking about there is if you've got an OS and you need to do a patch for that, you can actually go in and run through and set up a configuration so that you can make sure that you're not updating all of them at the same time and then your whole cluster goes down. There's not a whole lot that MarkLogic can do about that because the cluster itself was restarted physically from the OS. So some of these things are just nice that you're able to take into account and have the infrastructure run for you for that. One thing that we've seen as well that people are able to do with auto-scaling is to be able to look at aspects when they are going to go really high in terms of utility and usage. So if somebody has an example of a lot of requests are coming in, a lot of read requests are coming in, so they're going to want to be able to do something like an E node and scale out those E nodes or scale out the D nodes. So they can kind of take the cluster that they had and split it up into two, E nodes and D nodes, and then they can scale out those E nodes as they'd want. And one new thing that is coming very soon, I've heard from talking to the people at Progress, is there's these ephemeral E nodes. So if you guys have ever, it's maybe getting a little too deep here, but MarkLogic has a clustering aspect where you have to be able to vote for a cluster and you have to have over 50% of the cluster surviving. Well, if you've scaled out to have a lot of E nodes and you remove them, there is the possibility that you don't have 50% anymore. Well, now there's an aspect that they're working on called an ephemeral E node that allows you to be able to say, this one really doesn't have voting rights. And so that's one of the things that they're doing to help us be able to scale out customers on AWS. All right. So with that, they were able to increase the instances here. I'm going to show a demo later on about how we're able to increase and add instances back in for that. So, MarkLogic, what I just talked about, is designed to handle failure on AWS. I'm going to talk a little bit more about another challenge that we see customers have there, which is being able to get past the aspect of just getting it installed and set up. So one of the things that we talk about at AWS is speed matters. And it came from Amazon.com delivering a package. The faster we can get that package to the customer, the better it is. Of course, it has to be the right item to be actually useful to the customer, but speed matters in business. And that's where that comes from this. It matters with our customers here at Progress and MarkLogic too. So some of the challenges that we see is just delays in getting started for customers. So they don't know how to set up on AWS. They don't know what are the right systems. On AWS, there's a lot of different things that you can use to get MarkLogic running. What's the easiest way to do that? And how do I move my data from on-prem into the cloud? So you've got these kind of problems that happen in a slow migration process. And then the problem that really ends up happening is leadership then isn't really seeing what's happening, so you have a visibility issue. So how do we solve for that? One way that we solve for that here is, let me make sure that clicked through. There we go. Okay. One of the ways that we look at this too is in the migration process. So there's a couple of different aspects of this, and I'll talk about how we can solve for that in a second, is when we move our applications, there's a couple of different things that you want to think about here. Is you want to lift and shift, meaning like I'm just going to take MarkLogic as it is and move it into AWS, just want to run it on EC2, don't want to make any changes to it. Or do I want to kind of re-platform that, and maybe now that I'm on AWS, I don't have to do my backups on the same drive that I have that's also running MarkLogic, or the same instance. Maybe I want to run that and save the backups on S3 now. A very easy thing to do. MarkLogic can directly save the backups to S3, and then you don't have to do IOs on the on your actual instance that's running at that same time. So those kind of things we're talking about. Same thing for auto scaling too. So this is kind of an aspect that we talk about, is the 5 R's of migration there. So which one would you do? One way that we can help speed this time to value up here is with CloudFormation. It's an infrastructure as code tool. There's other ones that are out there, but this is just one of the ones that we use as a service here. There's the CLI too, infrastructure as code. But what this does is it allows us to deploy the infrastructure that's needed to run that architecture that I showed as code. And I can change it, which is really important too, is when I'm going from let's say, an environment that might be like a dev environment, then I want to go to production, then I want to go, staging to production, all these different levels, but I want to make sure that the infrastructure is the same all the way through, and I want to do that very fast. I can do that with CloudFormation. Or if something failed again, like we talked about, and I want to go in and redeploy this in another region, I want to make sure that I have everything running the same way that I had before. So CloudFormation is a way for us to do that. The way that it works is, I'll just talk about it at a high level, but we have some kind of format. It's in YAML file, could be in a JSON file, but then there's this format that goes in and says all of the resources that it needs to be able to go and deploy it. And it's a very powerful aspect for it. It's a little bit difficult to get set up and to code to create your own CloudFormation script. And so MarkLogic has already created one that you can use and run on it. And this is what it looks like. It creates that reference architecture that we talked about. It's a little bit updated compared to that one that I talked about before. But what it's doing over here is that it's creating, depending on the configurations that you set up, the latest one works on this too. I was just trying it earlier today. MarkLogic 12, you can go in and deploy it, and it will actually set up all of this infrastructure that we're seeing over here through the CloudFormation script. And you can tell it how many nodes you want to have run. You want to say how many availability zones I want to use, and you go in and deploy it, and it'll get all the resources for you ready to go. And I actually tested it out this morning, and I was able to do it in 10 minutes. I'll show you in the demo here. in 10 minutes, this was able to be deployed. So MarkLogic on AWS, fastest time to value. Let me pause for a second and show you what that looks like from the AWS console over here. So this is CloudFormation, what I was just talking about over there. And I was doing a CloudFormation stack. I made some inputs, just use the default inputs. There's a couple of them that you have to set up, but I'll just show you all of these resources over here. It was able to go in and deploy for me. Now let me go to the start of this stack so you can see the timestamp over here. This is today, right about 10:54. All right, so it might be hard to see over there, but that's 10:54 from the created time. In the time that this is the last thing that I created over here at 11, almost 11 flat, 11 and 26 seconds there. It was able to go in and deploy all those resources from that. It was pretty quick in terms of what's being deployed. I want to show you one other thing that allows us to be able to really fast go and deploy MarkLogic is the marketplace. So MarkLogic's on the AWS marketplace. There's a couple of different ones that you have there that you can choose from. What you do is you go in, you can just search MarkLogic over here in the marketplace, and then you can see all the different versions, and then you can just go in and click one. I've already done 12, so just to show you what it looks like for 11, I'm going to click that one, and then you can view the purchasing options over here, and then you just go in and decide on what you want to do and run, and then you can decide on what instance type you want to run and deploy it, and click subscribe, and it runs and it does it. Very similar to the CloudFormation script that we talked about, and within minutes, you'll have MarkLogic running. Now that'll be vanilla MarkLogic. You're going to need to get your data there, but very quickly, you're able to, within minutes, have MarkLogic and the infrastructure running that you need to be able to run whatever mission-critical applications you want. Let me go back into this. What I wanted to do here with the remainder of the time was talk about our custom silicon. So we have something called the Nitro system. That is a system I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into, but what it does is it allows us to, I think, really differentiate ourselves from the other hypervisors that you see out there. And I'll talk way more about that here in a second. We have something else that's called the Graviton processor too. So I don't know if you guys were here at the beginning, but they did talk about version 11, 11.3 supports it, and then 12 very soon is going to support it as well. I'm super excited about this because this is going to allow our customers that run on MarkLogic today, run MarkLogic on AWS today, to be able to make changes to it to be more cost effective for them. So what we're going to see what the performance looks like. I'll test it out. But when we've had other systems that are like MarkLogic run on the Graviton process, they're about comparable to what happens on an Intel processor. But the Graviton ones are cheaper because we don't have to pay for the Intel license. And then Inferentia, and this is one that is interesting for machine learning. These are our custom silicons. You can use this now that you have MarkLogic in the cloud and your systems in the cloud too. So I'm going to deep dive into the Nitro system, and why it's important is that all of these things that we're talking about are all the things that MarkLogic needs from a resource perspective, or a database needs from a resource perspective. So it needs your disk I/O, it needs your networking, it needs CPU, it needs your instance store, and then security, which is super important. So deep diving into this aspect over here, these are all the things that we thought about. If you look back to our fourth generation families, so somewhere around 2015, we started to create the Nitro chip, a Nitro system. And I'm going to talk about all the way up to our version 6, which is coming out now, so version 5, which is just, if you're looking at our families, it's like our version 7 families came out with version 5, and version 8 has them. Now we're on a version 9 that you probably don't know about. Maybe a little too much inside baseball here. But these are all of the ones that we're currently using, and it's going to look like we have a lot, but it's over a series of time that we created these features. All right, so this is what the system looked like before. So you've got your MarkLogic instances up here that are running EC2, and this is what a hypervisor looks like. And it goes in and it connects to your VPC, which is your virtual private cloud. This is networking, basically. It has to go in and talk to the networking over there to understand what's going on. And then we have our EC2 storage. That's basically like, it's a storage that can be attached to an instance, but it's not directly attached to the instance, meaning if the instance were to be restarted or killed off, you could attach it to another instance. And then we have local storage, which is ephemeral, meaning it's local to that EC2 instance, and then security management. I'm going to talk about how these changed. What it looks like today is we've removed all that from the controller standpoint, and now it's all on the Nitro card. So the Nitro card's handling all that for us, and it allows us to do a lot more performance and resources to MarkLogic. And MarkLogic is really good at using up all of the resources that you give it to use. I love MarkLogic for that aspect of it. It's always going to use what you give it to use. And so the more resources that you can give it, the more performant it's going to be. So let me dive into the Nitro card. And sorry, when I developed these slides, I didn't realize where we're going to be at on the presentation here. But we have a certain type of networking that we have over there. There's a bunch of different types of networking that you can do with EC2 instances. There's an elastic fabric adapter, which is if you're thinking about hyper computing or HPC computing, that's one that's over there. And then we have an ENI, so elastic network adapter. That's the one that we standardly would use for a MarkLogic instance, unless there's some other reason where they're like, we really need super fast networking. Then we would use that other one that I just talked about. There's a couple other ones over there. They're not super important, but they're also faster. But for speed, I'm just going to keep going over here. What we're able to do now with this is behind the scenes, we're doing a lot of things in terms of caching to know where you're going to go and how you're going to make that connection. And if you've done it before, then we're going to keep that. And depending on the size of the EC2 instance, we'll keep more and more there. What we're able to see is that with a single flow, so what I mean by a single flow is if you make a HTTP connection, that's a single flow. If you've done a VPN, everything's going through that single flow, or like a download, that would be a single flow. But oftentimes when you're browsing the web, you have multiple flows that are going on. Now, behind the scenes, it's not doing that in MarkLogic. That might be like an inter-cluster communication going through. Is often what we see is MarkLogic trying to talk to itself to make sure that everything is coming back correctly. So those flows are able to be 5 times faster with the Nitro chips. And I could dive way more into it, but I'll keep it to that. And this is where we're seeing over time, actually, where we're able to go and be even higher. This is multiple flows, not a single flow. So oftentimes, if you wanted to get really fast speeds, and I've worked with customers for this, where they want to be able to get super fast speeds running MarkLogic on AWS, we're able to get them higher speeds than the single flow that we talked about before, where they have basically multiple elastic fabric adapters on an instance to be able to get that speed that we wanted. Okay, so that's networking, block storage. So EBS, how does that also help us out with speed? Well, I/O, disk I/O is super important for a database. If we can't write to the disk, we're going to lose that data. We'll probably get f-sync issues if we're looking at MarkLogic where it's not able to write to the disk or read from the disk. You'll get some kind of f-sync that's going on. That's typically something going on with the infrastructure. And then what we've seen here with these newer versions, it's like I was talking about before, I've talked to a lot of customers where they're using an older version, like an R5 of our instances. We have R7s now, but 12 is supporting, that are able to use these later chips and get this increased speed that we're talking about here. So I'll talk about kind of the IOPS that we're able to get from this. If we were thinking about an R7, that's like all the way over here. An R5 is like here time frame. So you can just kind of see the speed that's coming by versions that's happening, and you don't have to acquire that new infrastructure with the cloud. That's the nice thing about it. You can just upgrade to the latest version by doing what I talked about before of those groups, where you're able to say, I'm going to make a change to the group, I'm going to upgrade to the latest instance, and I'm going to make sure that I've moved my EBS volume to the new instance that's going to have it. So all that can be done. Now, I said that there's a little bit of hand waving that I'm doing there where it isn't trivial to do, but you can code it to make it work. And I've done that with customers before too. Okay, so the next part is the instance storage. And this is actually kind of cool. I wanted to share this. This is what one of the versions looked like. This is version 4 of the actual instance storage that we have. So if you're looking at it there, that's like an i6 instance over there. And that's SSDs that we have. So we've upgraded in version, in our 6 families of versions, we have a way for you to be able to have fastest instance storage. And that is anytime that you're interacting with the operating system. So we're not talking about your data drives anymore and your D nodes. It's more of the operations onto that instant storage. But that's all ephemeral, meaning that if I were to get a new instance, that data would be gone. So you do want to think about it in that way. But what this means is that all of the code that's running the MarkLogic service, that CPU aspect isn't going to have any I/O issues. It's going to have less I/O issues because it's running on an SSD that's running through there now a lot faster. All right, so what we get with that is the lower latency. The Nitro secure system is what I want to talk about next too here. So these are kind of the aspects that we have of all of our data on that disk is also when you're running with these Nitro systems. And I say running with the Nitro systems because it's possible for you to run an older version of an instance in AWS that doesn't have a Nitro system. So you want to make sure that you're really running with the Nitro system. You're getting AES 256 encryption on the Nitro card itself. So something else to just think about there. It's not part of your control, but it's just something that's happening automatically for you that you don't have to worry about. All right. One part that I want to talk about too is I've talked about the card, talked about the integration with the hypervisor, and now I want to talk about security. So one of the things that we're just required to say is that we have a security model that's the shared responsibility model, meaning that the customers are responsible for their own data, but as AWS, we're responsible for securing the cloud. So any of the infrastructure that's running the cloud, the physical infrastructure that's running it, but then even the hypervisor aspect of it, we're securing too. And so what we're doing behind the scenes here for you is we're securing the infrastructure that's running that's running AWS, running the MarkLogic system, and that's running all of those pieces that you saw in the architecture that are talking to maybe other AWS services. Like if you were backing up to S3, if you're running through the Nitro system, you're running through that secure enclave. Same thing for secure boot and patching. So we'll talk a little bit about a few of these ones that I want to talk about. For time, I'll move past that one. So secure boot, this is one of those things that is just super important to the government space that I'm in over here, is they want to ensure that if they boot up the instances behind the scenes that's running the hypervisor, that it is getting the right version over there, and if it doesn't, then it's not using it. And so we remove those from you so you don't have to even worry about that as a customer. That's already happening. The Nitro chip is doing that for you. The UEFI is secure, booted, and then if there was any kind of tampering that happened in shipping or something like that, that's where that would have taken into effect there, and we would have been able to understand what was going on. Another one that I want to talk about over here is Nitro TPM. So it's maybe getting a little bit too more into the weeds. I guess I like to get into the weeds on a security standpoint over here. But basically, what this does is it allows us to be able to have an industry standard that we use in our national security space with our customers there. So you can think of places that need the most security. They're able to do this. And so this allows us to be able to allow our EC2 instances to run in these places and allow for people to use systems on top of that. So think about MarkLogic wanting to run in those places with those customers. They can do that on the Nitro system. All right. So MarkLogic is operational Zen on AWS. So kind of thinking the best place to run MarkLogic is on AWS. And I wanted to give you guys some places here to look at where you can go and to get started. So if you're thinking today, how do I get started on AWS, the marketplace, you can use that, the CloudFormation template, and then there's even an AWS documentation site or section of the MarkLogic website that you guys have there as well. Got a little bit of time for questions. If anybody has any questions, happy to take them. Go ahead.
You mentioned that MarkLogic.
I can repeat. I can repeat your question.
Thank you. MarkLogic is going to be offering an ephemeral eNode. Is that the auto scaling that's come out with MarkLogic 12, or is that something above and beyond?
Yes, so that's something different. I mean, I'm not the expert to talk on what their new features are, but in the roadmap discussion, there was an ephemeral node, which is basically when you have a cluster of eNodes. Do you want to take that? Yeah.
I didn't fully hear the question, though. Can you repeat it?
What is an ephemeral eNode going to be?
Yeah, so in MarkLogic 12, we introduced a new feature called dynamic hosts. And dynamic hosts are basically hosts that can come and go easier in the MarkLogic cluster to, with less operational impact, right? They don't clear caches. They're not part of the quorum. And so we're in the process of updating our Kubernetes operator, Helm chart, and also working on some examples for the CloudFormation templates, so how you could leverage those nodes with MarkLogic 12.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. So it'll be discussed a little bit in the training tomorrow as well.
Cool. Any other questions? All right. Thank you.